ordered your very first tissue culture plant online and you are now looking at this jar and wondering, what do I do with this? How do I plant it? How do I make sure that I have success? I'm gonna help you make sure that you have 100% success with your plants and make sure that you don't lose a single one when you're acclimating them out of tissue culture. It's a good skill to learn when you are spending your hard-earned money on these plants and you don't want to risk losing them. I have tried probably every single method there is, and I have lost more plants than I am ever willing to admit. I'm really confident in the method that I've mastered now, and I'm happy to share it with you so you don't have to go through the struggles of losing thousands of dollars in plants. And the best part, you don't even need to have a fancy greenhouse, a fancy grow tent. You don't need to spend a lot of money to have an acclimation setup, and I'm gonna show you the simplest way to be able to do that. The first thing we're gonna talk about is the supplies that you'll need. With these plants, they're in a sterile environment in here because they're sealed, they're in 100% humidity. If you've ever acclimated an import plant before, you understand the process of having to slowly acclimate that down from a high humidity environment for it to be able to thrive in your household conditions. It's the exact same thing with tissue culture plants. These are in 100% humidity and you need to slowly bring that down to either your greenhouse humidity that you're going to keep it at, or if you're just going to put it in your living room, your household humidity. First thing that you need is something to keep high humidity in an enclosed environment. That can be anything from a shoe box. I've put 2 cups together. You can even use something as simple as just a large Ziploc bag and keep it closed. The second thing that you're going to need is a jug of distilled water. They're at a pharmacy, Walmart, you can get them pretty much anywhere, probably even a 7-Eleven. The reason behind using distilled water versus tap water is distilled water is completely pure. These plants come from a sterile environment, so you don't want to shock it with tap water. You just don't want to introduce all that to this plant when it's immediately coming out of a sterile environment. So I prefer to use distilled water just to kind of ease that process. I also don't use fertilizer right away. I tend to wait about 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even a month, just to really give that plant some time to just settle in a new environment first before I start like throwing chemicals at it. The next thing you're gonna need is a container to rinse the plants in, so I just use something as simple as a Tupperware. If you ended up receiving your plant and it has some mold growing inside the jar, don't worry. As long as the plant is still alive in the jar, then you'll be totally fine. You'll just have to do one extra step to make sure that you get all that mold off the roots before you plant it. To tackle that contamination, I would just use anything like a bottle of betadine or betadine, don't really know how to pronounce it. When you add it into the water when you're rinsing the plant, it'll just help kill any of the bacteria that's left on the roots. You can even just use a bottle of hydrogen peroxide and add some peroxide to your water. We'll go over that a little bit more later. Next thing that you're gonna need is your substrate. This is the part where I have tried many different methods. I've used many different substrates. I feel like I've really mastered the substrate that you should use. Since using this substrate, I have had 0 losses and root like absolute crazy. I use 2 things and I mix them together 50-50 just because one of them is kind of expensive, so I try to stretch it as far as I can. My secret weapons to mastering tissue culture plants is a mix of perlite and a mix of fluval stratum. If you follow me on TikTok, you've seen how much I rave about fluval stratum for plants. I used it in my aquarium and then started using it on my house plants. It's made a world of a difference. It's amazing for rooting cuttings. Condensed volcanic soil, so it's already got some minerals in it and it's great for growing plants. Perlite is very common in pretty much any soil that you would buy. Using stratum on its own can get very expensive, and I just use this to stretch it a little further. Another item that I like to keep handy, just in case there's gel on the roots, just a small paintbrush so I can really like scrub those roots without damaging them. Fluval stratum is made for aquariums, so you can find it at any pet store. If you are ordering from like PetSmart, you can usually get a really good discount using their coupons on their app, or they do a lot of sales too. I'm honestly not picky when it comes to what fertilizer I use. I'll use anything from just like a regular philodendron fertilizer to anything that's like good for rooting, so like a Clonex fertilizer. I'm going to show you every single step that I take when I'm acclimating a tissue culture plant. Once you get this mastered, it's going to be an absolute breeze, and it is honestly so much fun watching just these little tiny plants grow into a full-blown house plant. Let's go over to my kitchen now and pull some plants out. I've got my stratum and perlite 50-50 mix that I've already done off camera. Next, I'm going to fill a container with the distilled water to soak the plants. Here I've got an Anthurium Ace of Spades, and I'm going to take it out of the jar and put it in the water. I recommend getting a long pair of tweezers so you're not digging your fingers in the jars. We're just removing the plant from the jar, and then we'll be putting it in the water to soak for about 5 to 10 minutes. During this time, I'll wiggle the plant around in the water a little bit and just make sure that it's completely submerged. The gel inside these jars are sugar-based, so it's very important to make sure that you have all of the gel removed before planting it, because obviously that sugar can cause mold quite quickly. During this time too, I'll also just remove any yellow leaves or any that are pretty close to the base and I know that are just going to melt away anyway. Depending how thick the gel is, sometimes it'll get really stuck to the roots and you got to scrub it a little bit to get the gel off completely. So that's when I'll pull out the paintbrush and just give it a little wash. Some plants are trickier to acclimate than others. I find that bananas have a lot of crevices that can hold gel, so you really want to make sure you scrub those. After that, I'll grab my container that I'm going to be using and fill it about halfway with the stratum perlite mix and just moisten it a little bit with water. Wasn't as prepared as I should have been, and usually I just use like a spray bottle, but I didn't have one handy, so I just dumped the jug in there, and I don't really recommend because then you end up putting a little too much water sometimes. If the mix is a little damp, I'll go ahead and grab some tweezers and just make like a little hole in the middle where I'm going to be planting the plant. I just find that's like kind of easier because sometimes the roots are a little difficult to like get in there because in the jars they tend to grow upwards, which is a little annoying, so you got to maneuver the roots a bit. Plant roots are fragile, so be very careful. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'll be using a Ziploc bag like I talked about earlier, just to keep that 100% humidity, and I will keep this bag completely sealed for a minimum of 7 days. After the 7 to 10 day mark, I will open the bag just for a few minutes to get some air exchange in there and do this every single day, very slowly increasing the amount of time that the bag is open. I've never found an issue reusing the same water when I'm acclimating multiple plants. Unless there is contamination, then I will definitely change the water just so I'm not spreading that mold to any other plants. Just like the last plant, I'm swishing it around in the water for a little bit, making sure that all the gel is removed, and then just picking it up and removing any old and browning leaves that are near the base. When it comes to using a stratum and perlite mix, you want to leave a small amount of water reservoir in the bottom of the container. So this is why I like using clear containers when I'm acclimating, just so I can monitor the root growth and then also make sure that there's a little bit of water in the bottom at all times. For this variegated banana, I will be putting another tall clear cup on top to create a mini humidity dome and keep that 100% humidity for the first portion of its life ex vitro. When you're using this method, always make sure to tape the cups together. I've definitely had plants pop the cups open when I didn't tape them together and have lost very expensive plants, so learn from my mistakes. Next up is dealing with contamination. So it can spread very quickly inside the jar, and if you receive your order, you see some contamination, I would plan to begin acclimating it immediately. Mold growth in the jars can happen very easily and start from even the tiniest speck of dust landing inside the jar, especially from shipping with all the movement and the air pressure changes. Sometimes sellers will often vacuum seal the plants inside a jar, or they'll even wrap around the lids with plastic wrap just to prevent any contamination. Sometimes it just happens, unfortunately. Some of these can be very harmful to your health, so if the contamination is taken over the plant, or if you're just really not comfortable, I would avoid opening it. Definitely wear gloves and a mask when you're opening this jar and work quickly to avoid as many spores flying into the air as possible. I also flip the jar upside down before I'm opening just to avoid the spores flying like right upwards to my face. Once the plant is removed, I seal the jar immediately after to make sure that no other spores are flying in the air, and at this point you can probably just chuck it if you don't plan on reusing the jar. Here's where I add a little betadine to my water, and peroxide is also an option that has worked for me in the past too. So this will kill any mold that might have been stuck to the plant still, because if there is mold that lingers on the plant and you're putting it in your substrate in a nice humid environment, you can risk killing that poor little plant pretty quickly. Again, I'm just soaking it in the water for a bit, swishing it around and pulling off any dead leaves that I see. After it's soaked for a little while and I'm pretty confident that I got all the gel and the mold off, then I will go ahead and grab my cup and fill it with the substrate. As I'm recording this voiceover right now, I'm just thinking to myself, you could probably add some peroxide to the reservoir in the bottom of the pot when you're planting something that had contamination, because when I see any mold starting on my plants like a few days in, I'll give it a spray with peroxide. It might be helpful to just be like a little proactive and put maybe a 50-50 mix of water and peroxide. I'm gonna have to test this theory out. Once again, I'm just filling up that container with a little bit of stratum in the bottom, like about halfway, and then once I've got the plant in there, filling it up the rest with stratum just to make sure that all the roots are covered and topping it up with water. Once that looks good, I'm going to keep it closed for 7 to 10 days. Once you have everything planted, I try to take it as slow as possible. You don't want to run the risk of rushing the acclimation process. That's where I find things will start to melt, leaves will curl, or it'll just completely die. My schedule will look a little something like the very first week. I will not touch the plant at all. I will just leave it in its humidity container. The second week, I will open it for maybe 1 minute every day and then just slowly increase that every single day. By the third week, I'll be at probably like 10 and maybe push that up to 20 minutes depending on how the plant is looking. To get the plant to household humidity, the process will usually take about 6 to 8 weeks. You really don't want to rush it at all. There's no need to rush the process. Just let the plant do its thing, let it get established, and then you can slowly start to bring that humidity down. If you prefer to have a written reference, I will put my website down below, and I have a page with all my acclimation instructions that I give to every single person who buys a tissue culture plant from me. I want to see everybody be successful, and I'm always happy to help people out when they're having issues or questions. That was just an overview of the steps that I take to acclimate my plants. If there's any questions that you have or anything that you would like me to go a little more in depth about, or if you would like me to show how to use different substrates, then just feel free to leave a comment below and I can start making some more videos. Hopping on YouTube is a very big change for me. Don't really know what kind of content to be making on here. I just know that tissue culture is such a confusing subject to people still. I feel like I have some knowledge that I can share with others, and I'm happy to share it with others. Once you have the process mastered, it is such a breeze to acclimate any plant that you want, and then you get to save money because buying them in jars versus buying a full-size plant is a huge price difference. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.